Hello, good afternoon. Today our guest is Professor Roland. Hello, Professor Roland. How are you doing?
Nice to meet you.
It's a pleasure to meet you. I'm a big fan of your papers. I've read them even though they're long, but they're quite interesting. And usually when I'm reading an interesting paper, I look at the appendix and also the references, and then I do research on those papers. Yeah, I love your research. Individualism, Professor, as you do know, is a fascinating topic in cross-cultural research, and many scientists are actually studying the relationship between individualism and long-term development, and also the relationship between individualism and institutions. So we're going
Mhm.
to start with a landmark paper you published some years ago titled Culture, Institutions, and the Wealth of Nations. But before we begin, I must say this, Professor. The Igbo people in Nigeria, relative to other tribes in Nigeria, they're more individualistic and also more likely to be entrepreneurs. And years ago, an academic, Robert Levine, he wrote a book arguing that the institutions of the Igbo culture were individualistic, and many also contend that the Igbos possess an achievement-oriented culture, and achievement-oriented culture is a correlate of individualism. But you may take it away and talk a little about your paper, Culture, Institutions, and the Wealth of Nations.
So, when you look at economic growth, this is a fascinating subject. And the main cause of economic growth is really innovation. So how does innovation come about? This, by the way, is a completely strategic, I would say, issue. There have been debates. So in the last few years, for example, about whether China would be able to catch up with the US in innovation because they're putting a lot of money in R&D, and whether they might even be able to, overtake the U.S. in terms of innovation. So the discontent of the Trump administration about China's strategy 2025 concept, etc. There really is a fear, or there was, probably still is in Washington, maybe even a panic among some, that China may overtake the US in terms of innovation. So if we kind of look back a little bit, we can wonder, what is the effect of culture on innovation? And here we should go back to Max Weber. Max Weber, the great German sociologist, he claimed, and quite convincingly so at the time, that it was the Protestant culture that was introduced via Switzerland, Holland, and England, that it was the Protestant culture that was responsible for the fact that England industrialized before France, for example, or Catholic countries that had been doing quite well. So the point is that culture may have an effect on innovation and long-run growth. So if we look at today's world, economists have been, probably more than political scientists these days, and sociologists don't really study culture that much anymore, but economists are studying a lot now. And they had been focusing a lot on issues of trust, societies where you have trust or where you have a lot of mistrust, how this affects economic outcomes. But if we listen, and I really discovered this literature, the literature from cross-cultural psychology. Very recently, there's this fantastic book by Joe Henrich called Weird, White, Educated, Industrialized, rich and democratic. That's a weird, but essentially Henrik was making the point, and is making the point in several of his work, saying that the culture you have in the West is quite different from what you have in other countries. And so cross-cultural psychologists have been using a measure of culture that looks at the degree of individualism or collectivism of a country. So, individualism, essentially, I need to give some definitions here because people may think, oh, I think this is what individualism is. Oh,
Yeah,
I think
but
this is
before
what.
you continue, Professor, I must say this: individualism is not selfishness.
No,
No,
exactly.
yeah, no serious researcher writes that individualism is selfishness. Not even Ayn Rand. No one.
Yeah. No, that's exactly the point I was going to make, that people may think collectivists are people who take into account everything, other interests, and individualists only think about themselves. That's really not what it is. But essentially, and since we have time, we can go over this quite thoroughly. So the individualist culture puts a lot of value on standing out. Okay, so standing out, be it people who, and culture is basically about what are the values, what gives meaning to our life. And so in the individualist culture, people want to stand out. They want to be famous, either either because they're rich, or either because they're great inventors, or they're great musicians, or great artists, or great philanthropists, whatever the measure. This is something that they like. The collectivist culture, on the other hand, puts a greater emphasis on conformity, and thus tends to, I wouldn't say punish, might be too strong, though it is the case in some, but
Penalize.
basically, yeah, people are wary of standing out. They want to stick with the group. The good value is how well you're integrated in your group, and the group, again, this can be the tribe, it can be the clan. This really varies a lot across culture. So, we can talk a lot about these differences, and they are, they have many other dimensions. But basically, when it comes to innovation, I think, the getting utility, satisfaction from standing out is something that is stronger in individualist societies.
Yes.
And also the willingness to deviate
From
from
the norm.
from the
I've
norm,
always made this point on the show.
yeah, is also something that is particular of individualistic culture. And so basically, with my colleague, Yuri Goronichenko, we first built a model that's actually not in the published paper because they, took it out, but we did a model where people derive profits from innovation, but in the individualistic culture, they derive satisfaction from standing out. So that gives a culture incentive for innovation. But we do give an advantage to collectivism. So it's not that we only look at the advantages of individualism and we don't look at the advantages of collectivism. We look at the advantages of collectivism, showing that in the collectivist culture, because people tend to adjust to each other more because they kind of integrate what they think others may think, they have an easier ability to coordinate. Okay, so and actually, this is very important when it comes to industry, and it's not by chance that the manufacturing hub of the world is being in East Asia, and East Asia more than other countries has an individualist culture. And so
a collectivistic culture in East Asia, they're more collectivistic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So basically what we were saying is that on the one hand, the individualistic culture has more incentives for innovation because of this cultural motive. But on the other hand, in the collectivist culture, in production, they can be more efficient because they're better at coordinating. It was quite striking to see in the 80s and the 90s how the Japanese car industry really overtook the US industry in terms of quality, cost reduction, etc. And people have been studying this. They tried to copy the Japanese organizational forms, but they didn't realize that the culture was different. And because in Japan, and people were, thinking in terms of, they were internalizing the interests of the firm, and so that makes it better for coordination. And it's same thing in China, same thing in Korea. So anyway, you have this trade-off between, on one hand, higher incentive for innovation among individuals due to this cultural incentive to be famous. But on the other hand, collectivism can be better in production. Now, the interesting thing is that this is not really a fair trade-off, because when it comes to long-run growth, those who have stronger innovation, even though they may have disadvantages in what I call static efficiency in the production, they would still win. So in other words, the advantage of the individualist society from that point of view should lead to more innovation. And indeed, this is something that we looked at it empirically. Countries that have a more individualistic culture, they have had a higher long-run growth. So there are some technical statistical issues when you look at that. I'm not sure I should go into that, though we can if your public is interested.
Well, though the members of the public can always read their research. I can put it up online. I don't want to get too technical, but I must admit that industrialization is suited for short-term growth, but for long-term growth, we need higher levels of innovation and radical disruption. So for example, maybe you're familiar with a paper written by Ode Gaylor, and Ode Gaylor is actually the co-author of the paper. The other person is someone called Raphael Frank, and it is titled Flowers of Evil, Industrialization and Long-Run Development. The East Asians did well in manufacturing because manufacturing requires conformity, collaboration, and cooperation. But in the post-industrial society, we're compelled to become more innovative. So after a while, collectivism becomes a disadvantage to long-term economic growth.
That's right. That, you're saying what I said in
yeah. I'm just highlighting the paper to the audience because we didn't mention Ode Gaylor, but Ode Gaylor did an excellent piece.
So, but let me point this out, is that when you look at this, there's a very strong statistical correlation between individualistic culture and long-run growth. But people can argue it goes both ways, that as countries grow, they become more individualistic. That would be the opposite of my theory. But, my theory, with Gornichenko, is that people who have a more individualistic culture will eventually innovate more and have higher long-run growth. So that's a little bit the idea. But again, I don't want to get too technical, but we do show that there is a clear causal effect from culture, individualistic culture, to innovation and long-run growth. And I think that is something quite strong. And so what that means also is that in the long run, there's no need to be afraid of the innovation that's being done in China. They put a lot of money into it, but the best researchers are still in the US.
Yes.
We can talk about this certainly for hours. But that doesn't mean that they can't do good stuff. So there's a lot of what we call incremental innovation that takes place in Japan, South Korea, China. Incremental, which is the opposite of what you say, radical disruptive innovation. And these things are certainly good also. But when it comes indeed to radical innovations where there's a lot of uncertainty, there is an advantage to the individualistic culture, because people motivated by their incentive to stand out are willing to think outside the box, and thinking outside the box is not punished. On the contrary, And old people who are like that tend to be attracted. That's how you get Silicon Valley and areas like that.
Silicon Valley celebrates failure. I actually have a piece on the topic for an American publication contending that the Chinese assume that one can sit in a lab and orchestrate innovation, but innovation is a process of trial and error, and innovators often fail. Therefore, if one is not willing to enable failure, we cannot conduce an environment that fosters innovation.
This is fundamental, actually. This is fundamental. And this has been emphasized a long time ago. I have some Chinese colleagues, Yingyi Chan and Chenggang Xu, and they emphasize very strongly that when you have decentralized innovation, there's a much more failure. And because the point is not just a failure. The point is that when something fails, you cut it, that you cut the funds and then you fund something else. But when you have centralized innovation, then once something is a failure, then you think, well, maybe let's give them more time, etc. And so you tend to have what is called soft budget constraints. So you tend to put more money into bad projects. But the consequence of that is that because you know that at some point you will continue financing bad projects, then you will be less generous to finance new projects. And so it's a bit the opposite in the US, in the decentralized innovation atmosphere. It's precisely because we will let many projects go to fail that we will fund new projects, and some of those will, it's always, the case that, many have to fail, but then one or two will be very successful, and then it's going to be winner take all.
And remember, Gerard, in business, the second mover advantage is very important. Most first movers don't do as well, and the second mover, because he's able to adeptly follow to adeptly appreciate the mistakes of the first mover, is therefore in a position to create a superior product.
That's right, but sometimes it's the third, the fourth, or the fifth mover.
Exactly.
Because in areas that are not yet well understood, there's going to be a lot of uncertainty, for sure. Yeah.
And researchers of Chinese descent, I won't say that they're Chinese because I don't know their background, but I was reading an article written by two men of Chinese descent, and they argued that in China, the bureaucracy is not pro-innovation. So on the one hand, the Chinese envision creating a country that's superior to the US in terms of intellectual output and technological output, but they're not willing to enable the free flow of innovation and failure. So for example, in China, foreign companies are forced to share secrets with the state. This doesn't make sense. To innovate, the state cannot exert autonomy over all entities. It is spontaneous order.
Sorry, let me correct you there, just to put some perspective. So when the Chinese, this is important because we look at things 30, 40 years later. When the Chinese started their market reforms, they were willing to accept joint ventures. And they were very poor at that time, and they said, okay, we will accept joint ventures, we will accept foreign capital. This was completely new given their communist mentality. And this was, completely new. And then they said, okay, we will have joint ventures, but the foreign firms, if they want to invest in China in a joint venture, they have to give us their know-how. They have to transmit their know-how. That was the deal at that time. And at that time, development economists, they said, oh, the Chinese are very smart. It's a smarter way of getting there. Now, when China is becoming a threat, saying, oh, this is this breach of property rights, violation of property rights, etc. So that is one aspect. I prefer not to touch upon it, but let me come back to the general idea. So China has both elements of the capitalist economy, and has elements of a state-owned economy. In the state-owned economy, it's very interesting. Let me bring you back, because this is something we know about in the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, you had a very good system of education. So does China today. It's improving its system of education. The Russian universities produce world-class mathematicians, physicians, etc. Absolutely great. They had a lot of research institutes. And if you're a researcher, you would had an idea, then you would propose an idea, and very often it would be refused, and you couldn't do anything because you're not allowed to be an entrepreneur. So that was it. And so they were extremely selective, and they were also very cautious, and it went to nowhere. It's only for the space program, the military program, that they were able to make some innovations, but they were really, very, very bad, despite the good education, despite the money put into research. And this relates to the point made by Xu and Qian, that when you have centralized innovation, because they will not let projects fail, they will be much too selective, okay? And also, there are some other differences, So China has those research institutes, and they're functioning like the Soviet Union, so they're producing at best incremental innovation. But China also has Schumpeterian entrepreneurs, and this is something important. These are people, very often they come a little bit out of nowhere. Jack Ma was an English teacher, and he was not an engineer, or something a bit like Steve Jobs, was himself not really, a computer scientist. And he built an empire, and with Alibaba, Ant Company, etc. So you do have Schumpeterian entrepreneurs, but this is the interesting thing now. They have been cracking down on them because, and this is a bit, I'm a little bit going out of the individualism collectivism topic, but it's really related to the Chinese system, because China is a capitalist economy under the supervision of a communist party. The Communist Party will not allow the private sector to become too important. And so therefore, by cracking down on Schumpeterian entrepreneurs, this is going to be very negative for innovation. Anyway, let's come back to your subject.
But Professor, I like your nuance. You're making reference to arguments that are quite germane to this discussion, because there's a broad debate. On one account, there's an assumption that China is a threat to America, but others surmise that the Chinese are not really a threat, and if China is not careful, it can actually implode. So
Yeah.
I do appreciate your comments. But I have another point on collectivism and individualism. Some years ago, Mark Zachary Taylor wrote a paper saying that individualism is advantageous. However, collectivism at the national level is superior to collectivism at the communal level. And I share this assumption. So, for example, during the golden age of East Asian growth, people were willing to conform to national productivity trends, and as such, we're not surprised that East Asian countries did so well. East Asian countries are more collectivistic, and as such, they were able to assimilate into the broader picture of national development and economic growth. Whereas if East Asian countries were individualistic, then people would have disrupted the status quo to make individual countries in East Asia wealthier. So on one hand, collectivism can be an advantage at the national level, but not at the communal level.
There are a lot of trade-offs, in terms of individualism and collectivism. Let me, I showed, and I think this is very important, that individualism has an edge on innovation. I think that's we see that. I also said that collectivism has an edge on coordination, and that does affect indeed productivity. But look again now with the pandemic. Countries with a collectivist culture adopted very quickly measures to fight the pandemic. And so China, even though it came from China, imposed a very harsh lockdown. But also other countries, that are not necessarily communist, but have a more collectivist culture, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan. And look at how Western countries did when it came, in Italy, France, UK. Not enough measures were taken. The US still has the most deaths from the pandemic. And so here, when you have something like a pandemic, that probably people who are educated in a collectivist culture can adjust much more quickly to it. So there's a lot of advantages and disadvantages. So one thing I want to say is that even though I'm studying culture, I think, we as researchers, nothing should be taboo. We should be looking at the effects of culture. But I would be the last person to say this country should change their culture, that country should change their culture. These are spontaneous processes that take place with history. No politician, no government can really affect them. And so we have to learn to live with different cultures and appreciate each other, work together, find ways of collaborating, and learn from
Yes.
each other.
Countries have different cultural heuristics, or as some would say, cognitive rules. So what works in China may not work in America. What explains economic growth in Singapore will not explain economic growth elsewhere. So I do agree with you. All cultures obviously are not equal. Some cultures are more advantageous to development than others. And even East Asians and people from Africa and the Caribbean will admit this. Not all cultural practices are equally beneficial, but at the same time, cultures do add individual value to their societies. But another, this is on the topic of culture and individualism. Gerard, I don't know about you, but I am a big fan of David Landes. Do you miss David Landes?
Yes, his last book on economic history, I think, was quite prescient, and he did indeed mention that, and it did inspire me. I have to say, it did inspire me in thinking about the role of culture for sure.
Well, I appreciate your research. You are a fascinating researcher, but do you think that if David Landes were alive today, you would be disappointed in the sense that we have access to brilliant data, but researchers are just so afraid?
Look, it's, we don't know. So in my own research, it's interesting that you point that, because I have been writing papers on looking at the effects of culture once it's there, the effect of culture on innovation, the effect of culture on democratization. You said you wanted to talk about that too, but then I started digging in history, trying to say, how come some countries are more individualistic? How come some countries are more collectivist? And I have done some research. I've been collecting data about institutions, the antiquity. And I've been doing this. It's an article that came out in the Journal of Comparative Economics.
When would it publish? Because I'm a big fan of state antiquity.
It was published last year, I think, Journal of Comparative Economics. It's called the deep modern roots of the sort of deep historical roots of modern culture. And so I started building a database with institutions from the antiquity. And this goes about what kind of property rights people had, what kind of government, what kind of law people had. So basically a host of variables over which we have some historical knowledge. And so I was surprised to find that I'm a comparative economist, but people think comparative economics started in the 20th century. No, if you look in the antiquity, you had countries like Egypt, the Egyptian Empire, the Chinese Empire. These had institutions that were actually quite close to central planning. There was no property right of land, no private property right of land, no private property rights of slaves, because the two were the main factors of production, you know. And we do see a lot of differences. And so I built a number of indicators to characterize institutions in the antiquity. And I found that there are really two clusters. There are what I called market systems, like what you had in Rome or in ancient Greece, in Babylon, in Assyria, in Tyre, or even in South Vietnam, just to change continent, or even Mexico, what is today the territory of Mexico. These were market systems, and then you had countries that had more statist system. China, Egypt, Peru. The Inca system is was very statist system. And the interesting thing is that countries that in the antiquity had more of these statist institutions have more collectivist culture today. So I find this very fascinating.
Yeah, so Gerard, I will be reading that paper. Repeat the name again, please?
The deep historical roots of modern culture.
Yes, and because you're interested in the deep roots of development, I'm going to recommend that you study the adoption of technology in antiquity and modern development today. So for example, Louis Potterman is famous for the State Antiquity Index.
Yes, no, I know that research very well. I know the State Antiquity Index, yeah. And I know Louis Potterman personally, he's a very nice person.
Yeah, I want him on the show.
Okay.
Yeah, but I think that, and I'm going to recommend it to Louis when I get him, but I think that maybe you and Louis could collaborate to do a paper on civilizational complexity. Maybe the issue is not state history per se, but civilizational complexity.
That's another topic. I'm also very interested in complexity. But this is a very orthogonal, because this has to do with modern populism and things like that. As the world is becoming more complex, people have a hard time understanding it, and they really want simplistic solutions, simplistic messages, which of course will not work. And since they will not work, when they fail, then they will blame somebody, and that will breed conflict. That's a vicious circle of complexity and populism. But anyway, that's a completely different topic.
Yeah, but they all intertwine, because individualism has several correlates. So for example, Frontiers published an article, and the writers argued that Asians value usefulness, whereas people in the West value novelty. And I attribute it to individualism. So for example, if you're an individualistic person, there is a greater essence for you to project your uniqueness as an individual, versus usefulness. Usefulness is important, but the West values novelty, innovations, things that are new.
This is very well known, actually. Cross-cultural psychologists have shown that different advertising strategies by firms appeal to the different cultures. So when it comes to buying a car, they will, in a individualistic country, they will say, this is going to be a unique car. Your car will be a unique car. But in collectivist countries, they will say, oh, you're going to have your car like your colleagues, like your friends, you're going to be like that.
Yeah, and even at the university level, collectivistic students are less creative. But this is debatable. We can measure creativity using different indices, but so far, this is what some studies have been showing. Yeah. Okay, then. So, hello?
Yes, I'm still there.
Yeah. I wasn't hearing you for a while. I was just saying that collectivistic students in other countries, they're still less creative. Okay, you heard it. But
I heard that.
Gerard, there's a point in your article that is quite lucid. We won't delve into it because it diverges into the realm of biology, and neither of us are scientists in that sense. But I'm going to read it. It's about the transporter gene. Yes. So let me read it. For the first set of instrumental variables, we use information on prevalence of certain genes in a population, the frequency of the S allele in the serotonin transporter gene 5-HTTLPR. I'm just spelling out the acronym, making people more prone to depression when confronted with stressful events, and the frequency of the G allele in polymorphism. And I'm going to skip a few sentences to read something that is even more significant. Researchers and these studies were done in 2009 and 2010, and others argued that communities with a higher frequency of these two genes and with a higher pathogen prevalence developed social norms to adapt to this genetic and epidemiological environment. So collectivism is a response to genetic structure. Some genes may code for depression, and as such, people develop social norms to buffer them against depression and other maladies. I just had to share it with our audience.
Okay, so this was actually the technical point that we used to show that there is a causal effect of culture on innovation, and it's related to indeed research that's been done in biology so just to be sure for your audience, we are not claiming that genes cause more innovation.
Not at all.
Very clear. I'm not saying that you're saying that, but people may misunderstand. That's not what we're saying. What we are saying is that, you know, you have different genetic backgrounds among different communities in history. And some of these have had effects on the formation of society. And so the striking thing, let me just dwell a little bit on that. This may be useful for your readers. So the fact that there are some variants of genes, that's the allele, so to be non-technical, some variants of gene that make people more prone to depression when faced with stressful events in Asian countries, let's say in Asian countries, the fact that people have a higher psychological suffering from being excluded from a group, that's also something that is genetic, has led societies to adjust to these genetic factors. And so collectivism, in a way, has been a response to the higher frequency of these particular variants of genes in those societies. In other words, the collectivist countries where you had these frequencies of genes, countries or groups, tribes, you know, whatever, this goes very, very far in history, adapted cultural norms that made them adjust to the genetic background. You cannot affect your genetic background, at least so far not, but people adjusted to it, and you know, and those cultures that evolved to develop collectivist norms were better able to adjust. So just to give you an example, you have countries that at the same time have a higher proneness to depression, a higher suffering from psychological exclusion. Because they developed collectivist norms, those countries have lower suicide rates than countries that have a, you know, completely different. So this kind of shows you that the culture, the collective norms, they adjust in response to what you have. But then that means some cultures became more collectivist in adjusting to that environment. And because they became collectivist, you know, these values, they are transmitted from generation to generation. And then today we have a culturally very diverse world. So these genetic variables is probably one, again, I want to be careful, is one of the determinants of the fact that we have collectivist cultures or not. But I'm not sure, I cannot tell what those variables, what, you know, I can tell you they have a significant impact. I can tell you that there's a very strong correlation between collectivist culture and then those variables that you mentioned. Again, to repeat, proneness to depression faced when when facing stressful situations, and higher suffering from social exclusion. There was this adjustment, but I don't know. I can tell you they're significant. I can't tell you how important they were in terms of the total, basically in terms of explaining collectivist culture. Maybe it's 20%, maybe it's 40%. Again, this I just cannot tell, which is why I have done some historical analysis that I have been talking to you about, which kind of complements. These are complementary stories. They don't necessarily contradict each other. They don't exclude each other. They probably go together.
Gene culture co-evolution and co-evolutions in a nutshell. This is what you're saying.
Exactly.
So for example, if you reside in an entrepreneurial country, then you're more likely to be an entrepreneur, and political traits and religious traits are heritable. So over a period of time, for example, several hundreds of years, people residing in some cultures are more likely to inherit traits. There is not a gene per se that is coding for religion or innovation, but because of the dynamic relationship between cultures and the environment, then some groups are more likely to be individualistic, in simple terms.
That's right. It's the gene culture coevolution. That's right. Coevolution is the key here.
So for example, there's a paper on the heritability of trust, and there's also a paper comparing CEOs and their relationship to trust. So for example, CEOs from more trusting countries, they're more innovative. The research is done along this line.
Yes, no, there's a lot of research on trust. I, for one, because I come from the comparative systems perspective, I thought it useful to compare actually individualism and collectivism. And it's when I started to do that, I discovered that psychologists have been discovered that long before me. It just happens that I'm probably one of the first economists to have developed this in a rather systematic way and empirical with empirical work in that area.
Yes, and a prominent sociologist who's no longer alive, his name is Harrison, Lawrence Harrison. He has written some interesting pieces on the topic, and you cite him. Maybe you are citing Culture and Progress. I believe that this is the name of the book. But Gerard, what people often forget is that individualistic people are impartial, because we're judging the next person as an individual entity and not as a part of a tribal group or a political group. And as such, individualistic countries are also likely to be less corrupt. This is something that's not known to many, but a new study was actually published by a Cambridge journal making these assertions.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't given thought to the topic, so I really wouldn't be able to tell you. I thought you were going to say that they're more tolerant.
Well, individualistic countries are also more tolerant.
Yeah, no, that's exactly. Individualist countries tend to be more tolerant. Just take a topic. I looked at some data, but I haven't published anything. But individualistic countries are much more open to immigration. Despite Trump and the wall, etc., the U.S. Has been, of course, is a country of immigrants, but the U.S. has been much more open historically, despite these episodes, to immigration compared to China or Japan. They are facing demographic crisis. Both countries, they're aging very fast. An easy solution would be to have immigration from other countries, but they don't do it because they are collectivist countries, and they this is in a way the flexibility of individualistic countries is that you don't need some social cohesion for people to adjust. What you need is the law. The legal system is very important so that people can behave as citizens. They respect the law. There's a rule of law. In collectivist cultures, the law plays a less important role in the sense that they expect people to be part of the community, and if you haven't been part of the community, they're more closed. Let's say they're just more closed in general, and because they're more closed, they take less advantage of the opportunities given by immigration. And again, you can see the same thing in the UK. Obviously, there are a lot of people who are against immigration because for all sorts of reasons, they can feel threatened, or they don't like diversity. But overall, I think individualistic countries are more tolerant, and so therefore also more open to immigration. I think that's
excellent point. I keep reminding my readers that even though some could argue that the far right is on the rise in America, but this is a misnomer, because I know many academics who have been accused of genuflecting to the far right, but they don't subscribe to the label. But I often remind people that Western countries are not very ethnocentric. So even if some people identify as white nationalists or say that they're racist, they may be likely to accept immigrants from other countries. Based on my reading of history, Western civilization, with the exception of a few places in Southern Europe, is not very ethnocentric.
That's right. So for example, a notion that is very important and that is associated to individualist culture is the notion of citizenship. When you're a citizen, you have the same rights and responsibilities independently of the color of your skin, your ethnic background, your gender, your sexual preference, whatever, etc. And you're a citizen, and so as citizen, you are equal before the law. And so that is actually a notion that was developed in the Roman Empire. And this idea of, civitas, citizenship, existed. Now you can tell me, oh yeah, but they had slaves, obviously, but
But Western civilization abolished slavery. I've discussed this on many occasions. We don't need to rush it again.
Okay,
that's a red herring.
Okay, no, but people may object. But it's true that the notion of citizenship really goes back to Roman right, and it's quite fundamental. And again, you think about Italy. Inside Italy, they don't really nobody identifies themselves as ethnic this or ethnic that.
Yes, and this is why it's unsurprising that studies have shown that the governance of property rights in individualistic regions is more efficacious. Individualistic people, remember, they're judging their neighbors as a person, and because they're individualistic, they also respect personal space.
Certainly.
And individualism is even correlated with institutional quality. The studies are just so rich and fascinating, and many of these studies are not old, they're quite contemporary.
But I think you have a point, but I have a little bit of a problem with that, in the sense that you have different sorts of institutions, and I'm not sure that there is one optimal or best set, that would be fit all countries, etc. So, which is why, I use those indicators of, world governance indicators, etc. But I like to do more fine-grained analysis to look at some.
Okay, let me give a recommendation. I've read 3 magnificent papers on the nexus between rent-seeking institutions and economic growth. So maybe in some collectivistic cultures, rent-seeking institutions are superior, but then again, there is a trade-off. What would the country achieve had it not been for these rent-seeking institutions? So this is something that you could study.
It could be, but again, just to come back to what I said, I really do not recommend countries to change their culture. I think countries probably need to have institutions that are in line with their culture, and then on the international scene, we have to exchange with people from different cultures, and we have to spread tolerance and understanding. Yeah, these are a lot of complex issues, and I'm in general, I don't want to make any strong statements before I've looked at, strong empirical, links, and some of these ideas make sense, but
They're not
they,
tested yet. They're testable claims.
yeah, they're testable claims, exactly.
Yeah, and this conversation is also quite revealing because you're open to new ideas, and because of your work in economics, you're not quick to make flippant judgments. But in another context, let's say we're in a different country, would you be so willing to say, okay, I'm not going to make a statement unless I have the data? This is also another issue that I've been contending with for some time. I've recognized that Western academics are self-reflective and they're less likely to critique foreign culture. So I live in a developing country, and non-West, well, obviously they're non-Western, but people all the time will say, okay, the Western world is rich because of slavery, or the Western world exploited Africa, or white people are bad. They will make these broad generalizations with no evidence whatsoever.
Yeah, those ideas, I think those ideas are wrong,
Yes.
and there's really no science to back that up. But it is true that there have been scars from colonialism. The biggest scar actually in Africa is not so much the colonial experience, which lasted roughly 100 years, but it's really the slave trade that lasted several hundreds of years, and so that has left a lot of scars. But I think.
But even this is a bit disputable because people like Morgan Kelly, he has criticized research linking all Asian institutions to modern development, and some writers argue that the slave trade has a disparate impact on Africa. Therefore, not all regions were equally affected, and we don't know enough about the exact nature of the trade because of a paucity of data. So even this is
No. So sorry, let me interrupt you there. There's extremely good work by Nathan
Nathan
Nunn
Nunn. Yeah,
at Harvard.
yeah.
Nathan Nunn, and he has also, who I know very well, and he has also done some work with also a friend of mine, Leonard Wanchekon, who's from Benin, about the long run effects of slave trade on mistrust in Africa. So those things are there. What I'm saying, as a researcher, we try to be rigorous in our research, but then as individual citizens, we have our values, and then we're ready to fight for our values. But I think as a researcher, what I can contribute is less, my personal opinions, which I'm, I write those on Twitter, on Facebook, etc. But as a researcher, I try to improve our understanding of society, social systems, because there's so much ignorance, and so that's why I don't like to make sweeping statements, and that's why I'm critical of people who make sweeping statements in all sorts of directions. But I'm happy to debate them. I don't want to censor them
Yes, but
in any way.
back to Nathan Nunn. I respect Nathan Nunn, but he's busy, so he's not on the show at the moment. However, the consensus, as you do know, in economic research is that slavery is universally negative, irrespective of the perpetrator. So, for example, Jutta Bolt and their co-authors, they have done a few papers detailing the relationship between indigenous slavery in Africa and modern development today, and their results are similar to that of Nunn. Slavery has a negative consequence on health and income.
Mm-hmm. Oh, for sure. That's who would want to be a slave? Nobody would voluntarily want to be a slave, and so this has left deep scars. So many things have been written about that.
But now we're going to discuss our second paper, Culture, Institutions, and Democratization.
Mm-hmm.
To expound, please, just tell us a little about it.
So essentially, again, it's with my colleague Gornichenko. So what we've been looking at is the propensity of countries with different cultures to adopt democratic institutions or not. And so again, we have a very simple model. We think, countries, all countries start up with autocracies, and then some countries have a more individualistic culture, some have a more collectivist culture. And so the autocrat can be a good autocrat or a bad autocrat. Again, this is to simplify, but the good autocrat, I mean, something like, the stationary bandit by Olson. He had this notion of the stationary bandit, or stable autocracy. We also know that there's so much variation among autocracies, so it's kind of, it's an interesting simplification. And so in a way, what we show is that countries with a more, so all countries would want to revolt against a bad autocrat, but countries with a collectivist culture may be less likely to revolt against what is a good autocrat, because they're less likely to try to experiment with, democratization, which has a lot of uncertainty, whereas people with an individualistic culture would be somewhat more likely, and so to do that. And so this is a very dynamic model. And so in the long run, countries with individualistic culture will tend to achieve democratic institutions with probability 1, whereas countries with collectivist culture will, some will be stuck with autocratic system, rather efficient. That's why it would stick. And some others would become democratic. So again, it's the idea that with an individualistic culture, you tend to, over time, adopt more early democratic institutions compared to collectivist institutions. I have to say this because even democratic institutions are imperfect. You've had democratic countries that behave like imperialistic countries that repress part of their population, but there is a tendency towards democracy, and this kind of again, what's our interest is that we see that there was this idea of modernization theory in political science, saying that as countries become richer, they all should become democratic. But as we see in reality, it's not the case. If you look at, again, China as a great counterexample, it's become more autocratic since it did the reforms. But similar things can be said about Vietnam, even Thailand. Thailand, has nothing to do with communism, for example, but Thailand has been going back and forth between democracy and autocracy. And South Korea was lucky that they had the student protest, but they had the dictatorship for a very long time. And then Japan, basically, they democratized because, democracy was introduced by the Americans. Same thing in Taiwan. But overall, when we take all the data since the 19th century, and then when we look at the evolution of institutions, countries with a more with more collective, with more individualistic culture tend to become more democratic first, and countries with collectivist culture tend to either stay autocratic or become democratic later on.
And the individualistic cultures could also be more receptive to free market reform. There is a paper on the topic published by Cambridge, but I'm yet to read it.
Mm-hmm. Obviously, that's it's interesting because so many things go together. The theory I was describing to you, in a way, the model is quite simple. But if we really think historically, democracy, well-functioning democracies are not only based on individualistic culture, they're also based on a tradition of rule of law. And this tradition of rule of law has taken centuries to be introduced, and what does that mean? It means that over time, countries have developed political norms where certain rights are respected. You cannot, with a majority vote, take away rights from people. That's something you cannot do, and this is something that has developed over time, and that for me is probably is as important as the right to vote or things like that.
And remember, Gerard, the rule of law is impartial. And again, individualistic people are more likely to be impartial. Why are they likely to express an impartial sentiment? Well, it's obvious. They do not judge people by their associations to political or tribal groups.
On the other hand, you have different rules. The world is more complex. So if you take Russia, for example, Russia has very face-to-face relations between people, face-to-face relations of authority, where it's basically showing who's the strongest. And so punishment of dissidents, there's always something personalistic. There's personalistic power. It was very important in Russia. If you take China, China is more rule-based. That is, I don't know if that's impartial or not, it's more rule-based, but the rules are rules that force the population to be submissive to the emperor. And these rules have developed for centuries and centuries, and this is kind of a cement of autocratic institutions. So they're also rule-based, but it's not the rule of law.
I would just go. Yes, thank you for reminding me. The rule of law is contingent on culture.
Yeah.
So what we consider to be the rule of law in the West may not be the rule of law in Asia or in the ancient world. But
absolutely.
Gerard, I enjoy our conversation. It was a pleasure to speak to you, but unfortunately I have to wrap up, so bye. Okay. But it was a pleasure to speak to you, Gerard, and I'm going to read more of your papers.
Okay.
All right, then. Bye.
Thank you.